Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to everyone here in person, to everyone online. This is a great day for a wonderful talk with Dr. Cynthia Reyes for this Migration, Mobilities, and Social Politics Research Cluster event. My name is Sarah Turnbull. I'm an assistant professor of sociology and legal studies at the University of Waterloo, as well as a faculty member here at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. And I co-lead the MMSP research cluster with Dr. Margaret Bolton-Roberts, who's a professor of geography at Wilfrid Laurier University. I'd like to start today by acknowledging that the BSIA is situated on the traditional territories of the Adirondack, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The BSIA, along with the main University of Waterloo and the Wilfrid Laurier University campuses, are situated on the Haldimand Tract, which is land promised to 6 nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Settler colonial processes on these lands are ongoing, and I encourage each of us to consider our relationships to this land and to settler colonialism, as well as past, current, and future migration to this place called Canada. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Cynthia Reyes. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Cynthia this last couple months. So she's been visiting the Department of Sociology at the University of and Legal Studies, pardon me, at the University of Waterloo. Dr. Reyes is a professor in the College of Education and Social Services at the University of Vermont. She currently serves as the Associate Dean of Academic and Faculty Affairs. In this academic year, Dr. Reyes is a Fulbright Research Chair in Anti-Racism and Communities at the University of Waterloo's Department of Sociology and Legal Studies. And next term, she'll be at the University of Alberta. Dr. Reyes received her PhD in Literacy, Language, and Culture from the University of Illinois at Chicago, Illinois. I'm reading. Her research interests include school integration of students and families with refugee backgrounds, global and racial literacy pedagogy, and qualitative research methods. And she's published extensively and is also actively engaged in community work, including serving on the Act 1 Ethnic Studies Advisory Working Group to promote ethnic and social equity standards in public schools. Dr. Reyes' talk today is entitled Reframing Equity-Centered Partnerships Between Families with Refugee and Immigrant Experiences, Communities, and Schools Through a Lens of Kapwa. And Dr. Reyes will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. For folks who are online, please use the chat function to pose any questions you have to Dr. Reyes. So I'll pass it over. Thank you,
Sarah. I'm really happy to be here today, and I appreciate so much being invited to give this talk. And I just wanted to let you know, I worked on this, and there's some things that I'm going to be presenting on for the first time, things that have been sort of flying around in my head for the last decade or so. And so this is the first time that I'm really going to be able to utter it publicly. And so I'm really appreciative of that. So before we start, I just had a few words of gratitudes. And so we've already, we've done a land acknowledgement, which I really appreciate, of our land here in Waterloo and Kitchener. I would also like to do a land acknowledgement of where I come from, which is Vermont in the United States, northeastern part. And in Vermont, where I am a permanent settler, the Western, which you can see on the right-hand side, the Western Abenaki are the traditional caretakers of these Vermont lands and waters, which they call Indakina, or homeland. We remember their connection to this region and the hardships they continue to endure. And this acknowledgement pays respect to the Abenaki elders, to the Indigenous habitants of Turtle Island, past and present. I also could not do this presentation without giving thanks to my heritage, the land where I come from. My parents immigrated to the US in the late 1950s. And so in some ways we are immigrant settlers settling in their new home. And so there is many gestures of respect in the Filipino culture. There are many gestures of respect in different cultural communities all over the world. But the one here is one that I've always, even as a young child, I really loved. and that's called pagmamano or manopo. And manopo, mano means hand, and po is the word for respect. It's respecting the elder, and it's a word that's usually used after a greeting, and it's used to respect the elder who you are greeting. And so it's an honoring gesture, and it's used in Filipino culture, and it's performed as a sign of respect to elders, and it's a way of requesting a blessing from the elder as well. So I remember doing that as a young child. And so just thank you for letting me do that. Just some really quick acknowledgements, because I always like to acknowledge the place where where I'm provided with an opportunity to continue my work. And so I do want to appreciate the Department of Sociology and Legal Studies. I'm really excited that it's such an interdisciplinary not only interdisciplinary department, but I would say interdisciplinary college of Faculty Arts, right? And so appreciation of the Office of Research for the first liaison. I talked to Ian Milligan, who helped welcome me to Waterloo. Fulbright Canada course, which has provided me with this wonderful year-long opportunity to do some work that I really want to do. And the College of Education and Social Services, especially my dean's office. I don't know, there may be some people from the university that are online, and I do want to give gratitude because she was able to release me for another semester, which gave me a full year. And so I'm really grateful for that. There's a table of contents, but I just want to use this opportunity to share a little bit of a bio, because the purpose of the presentation is to talk about the work that I hope to do here in Canada, in Ontario specifically, and in Alberta, Western Canada. But I haven't started the project yet, and I've actually just was approved for clearance by the Ethical Review Board for U Waterloo, and also the Waterloo School Regional District Board, as well as the Ethical Review Board for University of Vermont. So I had to do those 3 levels, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, some interesting things that I think about in doing this work through the IRB. So what I'd like to do today then is just share a little bit of bio, a little bit of my, some fundamental beliefs that I have been thinking about for the last 3 decades in my own work, and why I do the work that I do. So what I would refer to as my epistemological beliefs, and then how that informed some really important work that I did in 2017 with this school and with family and school integration with families with refugee experiences in the state of Vermont, which is a refugee resettlement state, very small state of 600,000, but we have had a really strong, vibrant refugee community in that state. So I guess I'll just start out by saying that before 2017, a lot of my work was focused on multiliteracies and literacy education, which is my background. And I did a lot of my work in the classroom. And so some of you may not have an education background or maybe teachers, and I'm really fully aware of my audience, and I want to make sure that I'm not just talking about, just teacher talk. But I did a lot of the work in the classroom, and then mostly creating digital stories with my middle grade students and my high school students, because I really believed in multiliteracies, digital story as a means of mediating and constructing identity. And so those are the ways in which I could really come to partner with and understand some of the stories that some of my immigrant students were trying to tell in the schools, and especially with some of our refugee students who have been labeled as newcomer students, recent arrivals to the US. Mm-hmm. But then I realized in some of their stories, there was a lot that I was missing. There was a lot of work that I wasn't really a lot of things I really wasn't understanding, especially some of the interactions that they were having with parents and community members outside of the classroom. And in 2017, with a good colleague of mine, Dr. Shauna Haynes, we decided to do a family school partnership study that lasted for 3 years. And that brought us out into the community, that brought me into the community and changed really a lot of the research work and the ways that I did research. So just a quick bio, I'm a child of immigrant parents who met in the late 1950s. I was born in the US, and when my parents came over to the US, they didn't know each other. They actually came through different avenues and different opportunities. My father was an international medical student, and he was able to gain his training. He had a very tragic background, but he was able to, with his resilience, he was able to move to the US, migrate to the US, and become a doctor, which he always tells me is a miracle that he became a doctor and not something else that would have been more sad. And he did his training in one of the largest teaching hospitals in Chicago, which is Cook County Hospital, which no longer exists. It's actually a very fancy hotel now in Chicago, but it has a really deep, long history of really, working with underserved, underprivileged communities. And then my mother came over. She was a trained nurse. And when she came over, she actually was answering a very popular ad at the time for recruitment of nurses to meet a nursing shortage in different parts of the US. And Chicago, actually Cook County Hospital was a hospital that had a huge nursing need. And so she traveled, and the way she describes it is, she said it was an adventure. It was a way to just get away. She also had a very kind of a sad life. And I think, this is one way in which they were really trying to go abroad in order to become educated and to help support their families back home. So they met, as my father describes it, they met in a hotel, in an elevator in Cook County Hospital. And they describe it almost like, if you're really familiar with American Hollywood movies, like The Perfect Meet Cute, they're in the elevator. And so the way, when they described it to me, I realized, I know that there's so much more going on in the context of how they are meeting in the late 1950s and early 1960s, where they are alone, isolated, experiencing different forms of racism, and whether it regards language or who they are. And so I know that there was financial sacrifice that was involved. I also understand that the historical and geographical context allowed them to migrate to the US because of the very conflicted relationship between the US and the Philippines. And the Philippines was a colony of the US for 48 years. After Spain, which had colonized the Philippines for over 300 years, had ceded the country for I don't know how many millions of dollars to the US in 1989, after Spain lost the Spanish-American War. And so it is this colonial past that I think is really interesting. And please forgive me, I have to look at some of my notes just to keep me focused, because then I'll just go on and on. I did not grow up explicitly learning. I think this is really important because this helps me understand the younger generations of immigrant families that come to the US and refugee families as well. I didn't explicitly learn or was taught anything about the Philippines. And what I learned came through bits and pieces of picking up books around my parents' house. Particularly a book called by Stanley Karnow. Is anyone familiar with that? It's titled In My Image, and it was published in the 1970s. And it was this most comprehensive book of the Philippines. And my father always said, yeah, this is a really important book. But what's interesting about it is he received a Pulitzer Prize for it, but I didn't really get to read any of the more serious critiques of the book until much later, which I read from Filipino, mostly sociological and philosophical scholars, who really felt the book lacked a serious colonial analysis, as well as different spelling errors and edits of names and places that they misspelled. So I think it's really important to note, because not understanding that there is an impact. There's an impact from over 300 years of, colonization, and then additional 48 years of the US. It helped me understand some of why I felt the way I did, sometimes walking around and not feeling like I belonged anywhere in the US, and also wondering who I gravitated towards, I'm going to keep focused. But what interested me about colonization is, in later years, is like, how can this huge archipelago of many, many hundreds of islands, different provinces that were ruled by different tribes that spoke different dialects, how were they colonized? And so then I, just realized it's because of religion, Catholicism in the Filipino case, and education. Especially after the US, there was this is really important to note, that the school system, which was implemented in the US during the time that they were there and still exists to this day, is really important, because then that helped to maintain the English language, which is like one of the official languages in the US. Interestingly, you know, the literacy rate in the Philippines is really high. And when I went to the Philippines, I mean, everyone of every class level speaks English really well. What's interesting, and someone told me I read somewhere was like 99%, everyone speaks English. And then just recently I was looking at a website that had the data for global English literacy rates, and I think the Philippines, it's been dropping. It's kind of interesting, and I wonder if that's a messaging about, you know, how it's contributing to a revitalization of Indigenous languages, which is really cool. Okay, so little history lesson just to understand, but I think it's important to understand the sort of the fundamental reasons why my work is always focused on equitizing schooling experiences for kids of immigrant and refugee experiences. And also the second most important thing, why I am in education, because I did not study education as an undergraduate, is really understanding the paradox. And some of you who are in education understands this. And I would say that Dr. Laura May Lindo totally understands this, the paradox of education, where on the one hand, you know, education can colonize. You know, you have to resist this, you know, the insidiousness of some educational institutions to colonize. And there's a lot of history that's been documented, especially in the US, about that. And on the other hand, there's a potential for education to liberate. And so that's the crux of it. And that's why it's been so important to me. Oh, sorry. So I just told my self-location story. I just want to talk a little bit about positionality, because this presentation will also reflect not only my wrestling with, but I think researchers wrestling with in general, in terms of their insider and outsider positioning when they do research, especially with communities with whom they don't identify or they do identify. I'll talk about Kapwa, reciprocity, how I came to really draw upon and return to Filipinx Indigenous theories. And just a quick word, I'll alternate between Filipinx and Filipino-Filipina. I know that there are some Filipinos in the Philippines that don't use the X, and because I support a lot of my students who are transgender and non-binary, I use the X, which I think is also important, but I want to also acknowledge that not everyone uses it. Harvesting reciprocity, what it looked like, and what did reciprocity in Kapwa look like? Even though I wasn't explicitly I was drawing on those frameworks, but I want to make sure that I'm explicit in saying that I'm not saying that I use this framework of an accord, but I drew upon it for my own self-knowledge. And looking at reciprocity across the borders, return to Canada. Just a really quick timeline. I won't go into much except the one in the middle, but you know, growing up in the US, something that I didn't really struggled with was the ways in which people who migrate to the US of different immigrant and refugee backgrounds become racialized. And race and racism is just something that we talk about in the US. I think we talk about it in all other countries, but specifically in the US. We have really been embedded in it. We're seeing what's happening just in the last 3 or 4 decades. And so growing up Filipino American in the US was quite difficult, because some people would ask me if I was Latina because my last name is Reyes. And then who has 45 minutes or an hour to hear my history, which I just gave you. And then others would say, well, you really looked, I went to Hong Kong one time and they said, are you from Hong Kong? Mm-hmm. And they started talking to me. And so just sort of struggling, and then going to the Philippines and saying, you're really American, aren't you? And so, I mean, I sort of feel like I really am that, represent the hybridity, right? And so it took me a while to speak from a source of strength, to realize that, yeah, I can see a lot of different things and be humbled by it and also own it. And as a graduate student, I still was feeling a little bit tender and not too strong about feeling this. And I was brought to my knees in a way when I was I'm kind of looking for my experience here. As a doctoral student, I was participating in a small writing group, and this is going to lead me into the insider-outsider piece. We were learning about insider and outsider perspectives, and for those of you who don't know what insider and outsider perspectives are, it's really, and I'm simplifying it so much here, but it pertains to the ways in which we think about how we conduct our research and who we are vis-a-vis the participants that we work with. So insider research refers to when researchers conduct research perhaps with members of their own community or people who are they familiar with or who share a common language. And outsider research refers to when researchers inquire from a perspective outside of the community and may not share religion, language, gender, age, and so on. And so we're constantly caught in this cycle of, well, how do we rationalize why we do our research? How do we, I mean, as a graduate student, this is what I had to learn. How do I support the work that I do and why, more importantly? And so as a grad student, I was in the small writing group, and we were comparing our autobiographical pieces and talking about reflecting on who we were. And I was honing in on my dissertation study, which was working with a group of Latina high school students, and I wanted to follow their literacies inside and outside of the school. And I was sharing this piece, and I had passed around my piece of writing to everyone and my cohort group. And one of the cohort members in my group was Latina. She had circled a word that I had written, and she said, I just want to come back to this. I had just finished saying, I'm teaching my 8th grade class. I'm an 8th grade teacher, bilingual Spanish, English. And the first day of class, I walked in, and my students, who were mostly Mexican immigrant and Mexican American, said, "Teacher, you got the dummy class." And you know why? Because we are not fluent in English. We don't speak English. They said, we don't need to speak English good. Not at all. And so I was worried as a teacher, and I was kind of thinking, how can I work on improving that deficit? How do I get rid of that deficit or erase that deficit narrative? And in my writing group with my cohort members, I was explaining that. And I said, I wonder if maybe they felt uncomfortable because I looked Asian and I was speaking Spanish. I wonder how they felt about it. And then my one Latina friend circled a word. She circled outsider, and she had said, she was reacting to the implication of the word outsider. She said, when she asked me, did I think I was ever an insider? And so, when you hear that as a graduate student, you're just, oh my gosh, what research study am I going to do now? Right? Because I was not living in a mostly Filipino community. I really felt I had lived isolated from a lot of our Filipino community in Chicago. And so anyway, I just won't go on and on about that, but just say that she was challenging what she perceived as a dangerous line of me crossing over what Clifford Geertz would probably say, becoming native, falling into becoming a native. And then at the same time, she was experiencing some of what she said later was a bit of the savior complex. So these are like phenomena that I really thought deeply about. I went and did my study anyway, but it really gave me some ideas about how to tread lightly, how to address that question in a meaningful way. So again, I'm sorry, I'm really simplifying these definitions. But I think that, when you do this kind of work, it's something that this line between insider and outsider is really, really complicated. And when you have, sort of these multiple identities, you're constantly wrestling with that. And I'm not saying that other people are not, but everyone should be. And it's for that reason that I fell upon and I started to return back to some of the history of my own families, and started looking, what's going on, and became really interested in Filipinx Indigenous theories, probably as a graduate student. And so I'm going to start explaining what Kapwa is, because Kapwa is something that it resonates so strongly with me. And sometimes I think, well, this is why I think the way I do, or maybe not, but it's a very strong concept in Filipino culture. But Psicología Filipino is this psychological movement, a movement of psychology scholars in the 1970s. And what they sought to do was to sort of begin thinking about some of the concepts that American psychologists appropriated and used to describe Filipinos. This movement was led by Virgilio Enriquez, who was born in who went to the University of the Philippines and also came to the US and studied in Northwestern. Again, it's this very complicated relationship. And when he went back to the Philippines, he said, there are some words that we really need to look at, that we need to take back and decolonize and undo some of these harmful concepts. For example, Kapwa, because some of the American psychologists, including, I noted the name of one American anthropologist, for example, of Frank Lynch, who used these terms, use the term smooth interpersonal relationships to describe Filipinos, how easy it is to befriend Filipinos because they are submissive, subservient, weak, inferior, easy to manipulate, easy to persuade. And so these are all kinds of descriptions that were attributed to Filipinos. So Virgilio Enriquez did this really heavy duty movement, and they decided to pull back. And one of the concepts was Kapwa. Kapwa is the unity of the self and others, a recognition of a shared identity, an inner self that makes one connected with and equal to others. And it's something that I'm still studying. So again, I'm just mentioning this the first time I'm really talking about it. But the ways in which I did a little bit more of his reading, and I think what's interesting, and maybe what I'll do is, let me see if I'll go to the next. Oh, I was doing my laptop. It's not working. But so I've given you one of the definitions, but I want to unpack it a little bit more. What's interesting about Kapwa is that when I read it, there's several phases to it, not stages per se, and not stages that are, static or that are, starting from 1 to 10. But I thought it was fascinating, and the only thing that I could think of, because there wasn't any visual, but the way I would like to try to humbly describe it is with this infinity symbol. And so let me just get back. So the infinity symbol, because then it would represent fluidity, nothing that's static. And I graphed the 6 phases on it, the 6 concepts. But if we start over here, which begins with Pakikilahok, and please excuse me if I'm mispronouncing. I spoke Tagalog when I moved back to the Philippines, and then when I came back, they really erased it out of me, and I erased it out of myself. And so I understand it, but I don't speak it as well. So pakikilahok, which means transactional. And so I think that's a phrase that's a definition that we all know in English if we were to define reciprocity, for example, but it's more transactional relationship. And then if we move along the curve, it's pakikibagay, in accordance with. And so you can see the gradations of moving closer and closer to the individual. And then we move down to pakikisama, being along with, and then going up again. And this is a much longer term. Pakikipagpalagay ang loob. Sorry. This is being in similar understanding and trust. And now we are using the word trust in there and associating trust to an aspect of Kapwa. And then we come down to probably the highest form of Kapwa, which is pakikisa, being one with the other individual or the community, which maps onto that longer definition that I read in the previous slide. And so I think about some of the different, the different dimensions. And again, I don't think of it as phases and stages. And that's what I think is so interesting about this and doing the research work for those 3 years is that I could be here, but I could start here depending on the kind of relationship I have with people. Or I could go back there with the same person because we suddenly had this contract, something happened, some external influence that intervened, such as the IRB, and all of a sudden we're up here again, and I have to negotiate that. So I just wanted to say that that helps me understand the fluidity of the model and really the elegance of it is what I think. Okay. So let me get back to, so Kapwa, again, I just wanted to say read one more definition. It implies, we already saw the word trust, implies the moral obligation to treat others as equal fellow humans despite one's status. Such a viewpoint is contrary to the position of exploiting others for self-gain. So I'm going to skip over a bunch of things. I was going to get into the Philippine. If you're interested later on, we can go into the Filipino lexicon, because there's so many words that really resonate with Kapwa. There's so many words in our vocabulary which talks about being one with other that we use to refer to family and family members. So why reciprocity? Well, reciprocity is one component of Kapwa, and according to Virgilio Enriquez and other Filipino scholars, they say reciprocity is something that you can, if you use reciprocity, and if you establish reciprocity, that gets you to, that helps you achieve some form of Kapwa. And so I thought it'd be helpful to just read some definitions of reciprocity, the scope, quality, or state of being reciprocal. I like this definition of reciprocity involving give and take, the interrelatedness of reciprocity and trustworthiness, which comes from, it's a very post-feminist approach. Rapport includes rapport, safety, honoring, and obligation. And in Tagalog, it's called utanaloob, is the word for reciprocity. Now, if any of you are Filipino, that might mean something else, but what it means is it's, according to David and his colleagues, sense of indebtedness to family or kinship. The way that I experienced utanaloob meant that I was indebted to my parents. If they helped me with my education, I had to get straight A's. And so that was a very conflicting relationship. I felt a lot of stress, but at the same time, there is something, or if you go to Malaka Garib, who is, she has this great podcast that talks about that. She's very young. She's Filipina Egyptian, and she talks a lot about what it meant to her. And so, but it's this sense of indebtedness to family or kinship. How am I doing on time? Are we almost done?
We're close.
Oh, good.
7 minutes.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to, I thought it was important to do this, and that's okay. IRB, I'm going to get to just quickly some of the people that I worked with for 3 years. Many of our students themselves, who were the doctoral students in our program, were our multicultural liaisons or interpreters for the project. We worked with them, and some of them are online right now and who are finishing their dissertations. And I have the honor of serving as their dissertation supervisor, and they're doing some amazing work. And really, the focus of this project was really to highlight and center some of the experiences of refugee families. We live in the US, and there's really not a lot known about refugee families in general. And some refugee families, let me just point out that, they don't want to be identified as refugees or newcomers, and we all know that. But, and so we try to, with their work, the people that, the students that I work with are also community leaders and are advocates for their communities. Let me just get to, so some of the publications that we've had. And I would say many of the quotations, I'll just read a couple quotations to you, but they come from the book on the left-hand corner, which is Humanizing Methodologies. And we're still unpacking some of that into smaller publications with our doc students, because there's still a lot to uncover for over 3 years, and there's still a lot more to learn. I was going to talk about some of the cross-cultural connections between what our findings in the US and the findings. What I'm starting to hear and learn about in Canada are very similar. And that is some of the things that we've talked about, let me just say, a lack of communication, where parents still do not have really good information about how their children are doing, understand how that works. I would say the biggest, the hardest issue of all is how to explain academic achievement to parents, how to explain academic achievement to parents in general. But can you imagine trying to explain the grading system and the different ways in which students are graded, validated, reaffirmed in the schools is extremely difficult, especially when we're working with interpreters. And so this is the work that we've really been focused in and looking at the community cultural wealth of interpreters and families and their linguistic skills. So the way that we've looked at reciprocity and the way that I hope to look at reciprocity in my project in Canada is as a relational, is look at the relational aspect. How does reciprocity work with families? And the way that I'm going to be looking at reciprocity here is going to be opposite to what I did in the US. We looked at reciprocity with the families, but here I'm going to look at reciprocity with stakeholder groups, such as nonprofit personnel staff, school personnel, administrators, coordinators, and multicultural liaisons, and look at how do they view reciprocity in negotiating their relationships with families with refugee experiences. Do I have time for one story? Yes, okay. I'll just share this one story in terms of reciprocity. Reciprocity is relational. One of the ways in which we benefited and one of the ways in which our students and families benefited from this study is that we used a method where we interviewed the families. We had hundreds of interviews and so on, and we interviewed 30 families and 40 administrators and so many, like hundreds and hundreds that we're still unpacking. And one of the things that we did with the families is we interviewed them a second time. And one of the questions we asked them was, could you please reflect on our first interaction with you? What did you think about how we approached you? What did you think about the way we asked? What did you think about the questions we asked you? What it made you think about? What advice would you have for us to improve this interview protocol if, were we to work with other families? And that was, and actually I drew upon a study, and I will remember the name. So it might have been McKillop, but it was a study that was done in Canada. So I really actually read so much of the studies that were done in Canada and the works, the methodologies that they were using with refugee families. So Suchandra is, so one of the families that we worked with was, came from the Nepali Bhutanese community. And it was really a pivotal time. I worked with a student named Hemant, who was our interpreter, and he actually graduated with his doctorate. But one of the things he and we were concerned about was the 5 students had dropped out in the high school just in a matter of 6 months. And some students were thinking about not wanting to go to school. There was something happening at the school district. And so we wanted to interview this family. And we interviewed Suchandra, who was a middle grade student, and she was extremely quiet. Her teachers described her as quiet and shy. They've also found her at times to be reserved, and it's true. When Shauna and Hemant went to the home and we sat with them, she would sit in the back and she would be drawing. She loved to draw, and she often spoke in a really quiet voice. And so we wondered about that. When we spoke with her EL, English language teacher, this is what her teacher said. She described her as, she doesn't get particularly driven about anything. She doesn't get stressed about anything. She doesn't have that hungry attitude. And so we thought about that for a while, and there was more information that we got, and we were thinking, and the other thing that she told us, she was reading at a 2nd grade level. She was in 8th grade, and she was going to transition to high school. What was going to happen to her? And that's what we were concerned about. Her parents didn't know. So that combined with she doesn't have that hungry attitude was something that I thought, okay. Now, to be fair, I felt really deficit sounding tone to that description, that one narrative of that child. And at the same time, we learned from the EL teacher that she wasn't getting access to the child, because the general education teachers who formed a team only invited her to specific meetings that only had to do with her English proficiency. So they weren't including her in any other meetings. And so of course she wouldn't have access. What kind of other perspective would she have? Which is really interesting. There was no room for her to advocate. So on the second interview, we asked Suchandra, said, what did you think about that interview, Suchandra? And she said, yeah, like I realized I needed to talk more. After you left last time, my parents asked me why I spoke so quietly. And so then she gave us an inkling of what her parents actually talked about what happened after we left. And they were, and so then we turned to Lenata, her mom, and said, what do you think, Lenata? I mean, what do you think about what she just said? And she said, it's not that we asked her to prepare to talk more, but we have been encouraging her, you know things, and you would be able to speak. And so that was a really amazing thing. If you know this particular family, and I've only just given you just a smidgen, but we have a whole chapter on this, that they really talked about the interview, and they didn't use the word we reflected on it, but they said, you made me think about this. And it made me think like, maybe I need to ask more questions. And during that conversation too, we talked about grading system, and we talked about how's she doing in reading. And do you know how she's doing in reading? And the mother decided after that she was going to ask the teacher and probe about her reading status. And so we've kept in touch with these families. And so now she's, I think about probably a junior, and she's doing really well. She transitioned. She joined some different groups. We visited her the year after that, and because we want to know how she transitioned. And loves art. She's an artist, favorite classes, and her parents seem to be doing well. And obviously, there's still some issues along the way. But now I'm not saying that this interview itself changed the whole world. But what's interesting is that relational aspect of it gave us information that we shared with other people that then made some action on it. So I will just go to the very last. I had several slides, so sorry if you want to know more stories. But I did, I think our students learned too, especially some of our students who were US born, where they had a chance to really examine some of their own assumptions. And then some of our international students who started thinking about race and how it's impacted the way they see themselves and think about themselves in the work that they're doing. It's been really interesting. So I just wanted to summarize that being in partnership with, it's something that we do that I'm drawing upon, even if I'm not doing any work with Indigenous. Some of our participants have been Indigenous, belong to Indigenous tribes from the groups that they belong to. But these are the three things that we thought about. It's open to changing dynamics in reciprocal relationships, interrupting these vertical power dynamics, engaging different perspectives. I think the important part is really always thinking about the social, cultural, and historical perspective, which is what I hope to do in modeling my own story, that I've always tried to go back and examine my own assumptions. And the cross-cultural context, I just wanted to share the questions that I'm thinking about right now. And one of the questions is, how do stakeholder groups experience reciprocity in their work experience? I'm going to be using photo voice solicitation to really dig into the literacy background, my literacy background, to show that there are other ways of expressing what we know, and hoping that that helps. I am wondering how they think about, how photo voice methodologies foster decolonizing approaches for gaining awareness of families, and how might findings from this study lead to more importantly, coordinated efforts. I think that's something I've talked to some of the people here in Canada already, that it's just coordinating efforts. When we talk about funding sources that come from different places is so interesting, and just how to do that more effectively. I just want to end with Dr. Lenny Strobel, who I'm a really big fan of, who's still living, but she is my mentor. You can use all the deconstructive theories, post-colonial, postmodern theorizing. By then there comes a time when your body begins to speak. What is your body saying? For me, that is when decolonization evolved into something that's no longer metaphorical. something more real and material. And so I just wanted to end with Dr. Lenny Strobel. Thank you. Salamat po. Thank you. Gracias.